and a full budget request for fiscal year 2026. The spend plan is required by law. It was due to Congress over a week ago. We have not yet seen it. That is really absurd. The FBI is our nation's leading law enforcement agency, a budget of $10.7 billion. It is critical that we understand how you are spending taxpayer dollars. So, Director Patel, when should we expect this FY25 spend plan for the FBI? Have you seen it? Have you reviewed it? When will we get it?
I'll get you an answer, ma'am. I don't have a timeline on that.
May 8th, 2025. Washington, D.C. A Senate budget hearing that should have been procedural turned into a 5-minute collision between law, money, and credibility. One legally mandated document, missing, more than 7 days overdue. A proposed $500 million cut to the FBI. Nearly 1,900 employees already gone since 2023. And at the center of it, Kash Patel, who just 24 hours earlier told Congress the Bureau needed $1 billion more, then walked into the Senate and said he would make this budget work. So what changed overnight? The facts or the pressure? This is not a normal oversight hearing. It is a stress test of whether the rules written into law still mean anything when they meet power in real time. The exchange opens without theatrics, but the absence is the story. Senator Patty Murray doesn't begin with ideology. She begins with a document, a spend plan, required by law. Due the week before, not submitted. No ambiguity there. Not a guideline, not a suggestion, a statutory obligation. And yet, the director of the FBI is sitting in front of the Senate without it. No timeline, no delivery date, no explanation that holds under scrutiny. Patel says he is following the law. That line lands flat the moment you align it with the timeline. A document required by law, overdue by more than 7 days. No defined path to compliance, and still, I am following the law. That is not just a delay, that is a contradiction, and the hearing does not slow down to resolve it, because the next layer hits immediately. Day 1, House Appropriations. Patel breaks with the administration, says the FBI needs more funding. Explicitly, $1 billion more. Day 2, Senate. He agrees with the budget as it stands and says the Bureau will make it work. Same director, same week. Two positions that cannot comfortably exist together. The generous reading says he was clarifying. The harder reading says something happened between those two rooms. No one says it out loud. But the timeline says enough. Murray does not chase the reversal. She pivots to something more concrete, the missing structure behind the numbers. Because budgets are not abstract. They decide how many agents show up, which cases get priority, which threats are tracked, and which are ignored. And right now, there is no budget, no full request, no spend plan, no timeline. The director of the FBI came to a budget hearing without a budget. Pause on that. Not a misstatement, not a technicality. The person responsible for allocating federal law enforcement resources is answering questions without the document that defines those allocations. Murray calls it downright incompetent. That is not political theater. That is a direct characterization, on record, of operational failure. And then the numbers begin to stack. 1,900 employees lost since 2023. Over $800 million already cut from local law enforcement assistance. Another $500 million proposed to be removed from the FBI itself. At the same time, the mission is expanding. Immigration enforcement added on top of counterterrorism, criminal investigations, cyber threats. More work, fewer people, less money. And the assurance given to Congress is simple: we will make it work. That phrase sounds confident. It is also empty without a plan behind it. Because when a system is asked to do more with less, something does not stretch. It breaks. And this is where the hearing stops being about paperwork and starts becoming about consequences. Because when Senator Patty Murray shifts the focus, she does not talk about spreadsheets. She talks about operations, real ones. Fieldwork, joint task forces that do not exist on paper, but in neighborhoods, in coordination rooms, in late-night calls between federal agents and local officers trying to stop something before it happens. A few years earlier, one of those partnerships, an FBI Safe Streets task force working with county sheriffs and local police, pulled off one of the largest drug seizures in that region's history. Not theory, not projections, actual drugs off the street. That kind of operation is not built overnight. It is built on funding, on continuity, on agents who are not constantly reassigned, on relationships that are not disrupted every budget cycle. Cut the funding, and the task force shrinks. Reassign the agents, and the coordination breaks. Delay the budget, and planning stops. That is the chain reaction. And yet, sitting in that hearing, the assurance is still the same. We will continue the mission. But the math does not support the promise. Less funding, fewer people, expanded responsibilities. Something has to give. And Murray forces that contrast without raising her voice. She lays out the numbers like evidence in a case file. Over $800 million already cut from local law enforcement assistance. Another $500 million proposed to be removed from the FBI itself. Nearly 2,000 employees gone. At the same time, new directives are coming in. Immigration enforcement layered on top of existing national security and criminal investigation duties. So the question becomes unavoidable. Where does the capacity come from? Not theoretically, not politically, operationally. Which unit gets fewer agents? Which investigation gets delayed? Which threat gets deprioritized? Those are not abstract trade-offs. Those are decisions that shape outcomes. And Patel does what many witnesses do under pressure. He pivots. He says the FBI will continue working with state and local partners. He references joint terrorism task forces, Safe Streets programs. He confirms that those positions have been maintained. Maintained. That word sounds stable. It also avoids the question of expansion, strain, or sustainability. Maintaining a system under increasing pressure is not the same as strengthening it. It is holding the line while the ground shifts underneath. Then comes the one clear commitment in the entire exchange. Murray asks about the background check system, the infrastructure that screens firearm purchases across the country. Will it continue to be funded and operated? Patel says yes. Direct, unambiguous. No deflection. And it stands out precisely because everything else does not have that clarity. No timeline for the budget, no delivery date for the spend plan, no detailed explanation for the overnight reversal, no operational breakdown of how the Bureau absorbs cuts while expanding its mission. Just assurances. And assurances are not plans. They are placeholders. This is where the hearing tightens. Because when answers remain broad, senators narrow the focus. And Murray does exactly that. She shifts from money to accountability, from structure to decisions, from what the FBI is doing to what it has done. And that is when the conversation turns to something far more volatile than budgets. January 6th. Not as an event, as a line inside the Bureau itself. And this is where the tone of the hearing shifts from pressure to exposure. Because when Senator Patty Murray brings up January 6th, she is not asking about budgets anymore. She is asking about intent, about motive, about whether decisions inside the FBI are being driven by law or by something else. She lays it out directly. Reports that FBI employees who worked on January 6th investigations were placed on leave. Career agents, Analysts, people who followed cases tied to one of the most politically sensitive events in recent history, and she connects it to something bigger. Promises made during confirmation. No politicization, no retribution, clear commitments. So the question is simple. Are those promises being kept? Kash Patel does not answer that question directly. He rejects the premise, calls it wildly inaccurate. And then, instead of addressing the specific claim, he pivots hard into statistics. 8,276 federal arrests, 820 kilograms of fentanyl seized, thousands of firearms taken off the streets, hundreds of gang cases. Those numbers are real. They matter. They represent actual enforcement, but they do not answer the question. Because the question was not whether the FBI is doing its job in general. The question was whether specific employees were removed for doing a specific job. And those are not interchangeable. Murray cuts through it immediately. That's not my question. Short, direct, surgical. She brings it back to the core issue. Employees placed on leave. Work tied to January 6th. The appearance, whether confirmed or not, of internal retaliation. Patel adjusts, but not by providing details. He says no one was placed on leave unless they violated ethical obligations or their oath. That sounds like a standard. It also raises a new problem. Because now the claim shifts from "it didn't happen" to "it happened for a justified reason." And that reason is never defined. No names, no violations listed, no timelines, no explanation of how those ethical breaches were identified or applied consistently across the Bureau. Just a standard stated in the abstract. And Murray sees the gap immediately. So she tests it. If those employees were working on January 6th cases, are you saying that work itself violated ethical obligations? Patel says no. So now the structure is clear. They were not punished for the cases. They were punished for something else. But that something else is never specified. That is the tension. Because when an institution removes people, but cannot, or will not, explain why in concrete terms, the vacuum gets filled with interpretation. And in a political environment, interpretation hardens into suspicion. Then comes the Russia case. An analyst tied to the investigation into 2016 election interference placed on leave. Murray brings it up directly. Is that politicization? Is that retribution? Patel's answer does not resolve it. He says not if the person broke the law or violated guidelines. And then he adds something more revealing than any statistic. He says he does not know the specific case she is referring to. Pause there. The director of the FBI is being asked about a high-profile personnel action tied to a politically sensitive investigation. And his answer is that he does not know the details. That is not just a gap in knowledge. That is a fracture in accountability. Because either the decision was significant, and he should know it, or it was routine, and it should not have reached this level of concern. But sitting in that hearing, it is both. Significant enough to be raised publicly. Vague enough to remain undefined. And then, instead of clarifying, Patel shifts again, away from the employees, away from the cases, toward himself. He says if anyone wants to talk about being targeted by a weaponized bureau, they are looking at him. Not an explanation, a reframing. The focus moves from institutional decisions to personal narrative, from what the FBI did to what happened to him. And in that moment, the hearing changes shape again. Because now the question is no longer just about actions, it is about justification. And this is where the hearing stops being about answers and becomes about meaning. Because once Kash Patel reframes himself as the victim of a weaponized bureau, everything that came before it starts to shift under a different light. The missing budget is no longer just a delay. The overdue spend plan is no longer just disorganization. The unexplained personnel decisions are no longer isolated cases. They become part of a narrative, a story where the institution was broken and now is being cleaned up. That phrase sounds decisive. It is also dangerously vague. Cleaning up what? Misconduct? Bias? Inefficiency? Or simply people viewed as disloyal? Those are not the same thing, and the difference is not academic. Because when a federal law enforcement agency removes people for misconduct, it strengthens trust. When it removes people for perceived loyalty issues, it erodes it. And in that hearing, that line is never clearly drawn. No documents, no names, no specific violations, just the assertion that standards were applied, and the expectation that the public will accept that without seeing how. This is where Senator Patty Murray delivers the quietest and most important counterpoint of the entire exchange. She does not argue with his personal story. She does not try to disprove his claim. She shifts the frame back to the institution. The FBI's job is to keep the entire country safe. Not one party, not one administration, not one group of perceived enemies. The entire country. That is not rhetoric. That is the baseline expectation of a federal agency with the power to investigate, surveil, and prosecute. And that is what makes the earlier moments in the hearing matter more, not less. Because when a budget hearing happens without a budget, it signals opacity. When a legally required document is overdue with no timeline, it signals disorder. When direct questions are answered with unrelated statistics, it signals deflection. When personnel actions are justified without details, it signals ambiguity. Individually, each of those can be explained away. Together, they form a pattern, and patterns are what oversight is designed to detect. This is the accumulation problem. One answer that does not answer. Another claim that widens the frame. Another pivot away from specifics. And finally, a personal narrative that attempts to redefine the entire institution. That is how the core question survives every response without ever being resolved. Was the law followed? Was the Bureau politicized? Were decisions made based on evidence or alignment? Those questions remain intact at the end of the exchange, untouched. And that is the real outcome of the hearing. Not a scandal proven, not a defense confirmed. A vacuum. Because when clarity is requested and ambiguity is delivered, the absence becomes the story. And that absence does not stay inside a hearing room. It moves outward, into public trust, into how people see the agency that is supposed to operate above politics, into whether citizens believe that the same rules apply at the top as they do everywhere else. So here is the question that remains after everything was said, and everything that was avoided. If the law requires a document and it is not delivered, is the law still being followed? If employees are removed without explanation, is accountability being enforced or avoided? If answers replace specifics with narratives, is that transparency or control? And more importantly, when the agency tasked with enforcing the law begins to blur its own lines, who holds it accountable? That is not a partisan question. That is a structural one. Because systems do not fail all at once. They drift, slowly, one unanswered question at a time. If you want more breakdowns like this, clear, direct, and built on what was actually said, not what was claimed, hit like, drop your thoughts in the comments, share this with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for the next hearing that doesn't go the way it was supposed to.